Nvidia just changed everything. Not with a product launch, not with a keynote, not with a single headline that the tech press could point to and say, "This is the moment." They did it the way the most consequential decisions in the industry always get, made quietly, incrementally, in a way that only becomes obvious after it is already too late to reverse. And Windows just lost the one partner it could never afford to lose. For 30 years, the relationship between Nvidia and Windows was the backbone of PC gaming. You bought a Windows machine. You bought an Nvidia GPU. Everything worked. The drivers were optimized for Windows first. The features launched on Windows first. The performance benchmarks were run on Windows first. DirectX, developed by Microsoft, ran on Nvidia hardware, sold to Windows users. The three-way relationship between Microsoft, Nvidia, and the PC gaming market was so tight, so mutually reinforcing, that challenging it seemed not just difficult but structurally impossible. That structure is now coming apart, and Nvidia is the one pulling the threads. Here is what happened and why almost nobody is framing it correctly. Nvidia's business has undergone a fundamental transformation over the past 3 years. Gaming GPUs, the product line that built Nvidia's brand and made them a household name, now represent a shrinking percentage of their total revenue. The money, the real money, is in data centers, AI training, machine learning infrastructure, the H100, the H200, the Blackwell architecture. These are the products that turned Nvidia into one of the most valuable companies on earth. And every single one of those products runs on Linux, not Windows. Linux. Every major AI research lab runs Linux. Every hyperscale data center runs Linux. Every cloud provider, AWS, Google Cloud, Azure itself runs their GPU compute infrastructure on Linux. When Nvidia's engineers optimize their drivers, when their software teams prioritize compatibility, when their architecture decisions get made, they are optimizing for the environment where 90% of their revenue actually comes from. And that environment is Linux. The gaming driver has not been abandoned, but it has been deprioritized in ways that are now measurable. Linux users with Nvidia GPUs have been reporting something that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. In certain workloads, particularly DX12 titles running through Proton, AMD GPUs on Linux are outperforming Nvidia GPUs running the same games on Windows. The RTX 5090, Nvidia's flagship consumer GPU, being matched or beaten in specific titles by AMD hardware that costs a fraction of the price. That is not a driver bug. That is what happens when a company's optimization priorities shift away from the use case that used to define them. But here is the part that reveals how complete this shift actually is. Nvidia has been building something on Linux that they never needed to build before. Their open-source kernel driver, released and actively maintained on GitHub, represents a philosophical commitment that Nvidia historically never made. For decades, Nvidia's Linux drivers were proprietary, poorly documented, inconsistently updated, and openly hostile to the open-source ecosystem. Linux users with Nvidia cards accepted degraded performance as the cost of choosing green. That is no longer the position Nvidia holds. The open-source kernel driver rollout was not a PR gesture. It was an infrastructure decision driven by the data center business. When your customers are running tens of thousands of Nvidia GPUs in Linux-based clusters, you cannot afford to have driver issues. You cannot afford proprietary opacity. You need kernel-level integration that works reliably at scale across every Linux distribution your customers deploy. Nvidia built that, and in building it for the data center, they accidentally fixed Linux gaming. Accidentally is the wrong word. Strategically is more accurate. GeForce Now is the next piece of this, and it is being dramatically underreported. GeForce Now is Nvidia's cloud gaming platform. It streams full PC games at high settings to any device with a browser. It runs on Chromebook. It runs on Linux laptops. It runs on 5-year-old hardware that could never run those games locally. The game executes on Nvidia's servers, which run Linux, and the client machine receives the output stream. The operating system on the client machine is completely irrelevant. Think about what that means for Windows. Microsoft's entire gaming lock-in was built on the premise that games run on Windows hardware. DirectX runs on Windows. Your GPU is optimized for Windows. Your game library is on a Windows machine. Every layer of that argument assumed that the game was running locally on a Windows PC. GeForce Now removes that assumption entirely. When Nvidia streams the game from their Linux servers, they have removed Windows from the equation on both ends. The server is Linux. The client does not care. Microsoft cannot sell you a Windows license when the game is not running on your machine. Enter the Vulkan story, which is where Nvidia's technical direction becomes impossible to misread. Vulkan is a graphics API developed by the Kronos Group, an open standard that runs on Windows, Linux, Mac OS, Android, and virtually every other modern platform. DirectX 12 is Microsoft's equivalent, proprietary. Windows only, and the technology that has kept game developers tied to Windows for a decade. Nvidia has been aggressively expanding their Vulkan implementation. Their Vulkan performance on Linux has reached near parity with DirectX on Windows for a growing list of titles. In some cases, it has exceeded it. When Nvidia optimizes Vulkan, they are optimizing for every platform simultaneously. When Microsoft optimizes DirectX 12, they are optimizing for Windows exclusively. The long-term trajectory of those two decisions is not subtle. One builds a wall. The other builds a road that goes everywhere. Game developers follow performance and audience. Right now, the Linux gaming audience is still smaller than Windows, but the gap is closing faster than the market share numbers suggest. Steam's hardware survey captures users who have already switched deliberately. A self-selected group that represents the motivated leading edge of a much larger potential audience. Proton has made over 19,000 titles playable on Linux. The compatibility argument against Linux gaming is structurally weaker than it has ever been, and Nvidia's improving Linux support removes the last major, GPU-level excuse. The moment any major title ships with native Linux support backed by Nvidia's full driver stack, the conversion rate from that title's Windows player base will be significant. Not because Linux is aggressively marketed, because it will simply work, and working is the only argument that has ever actually moved users. Here is what the combined picture looks like when you step back far enough to see it whole. 3 years ago, choosing Linux for gaming meant accepting Nvidia performance penalties, limited game compatibility, and a peripheral ecosystem that barely functioned. Today, AMD GPUs on Linux match or exceed their Windows performance. Nvidia's Linux drivers are open source and actively improving. Proton runs 19,000 titles. GeForce now streams from Linux servers to any device. Baysite, Nobera, and Pop! OS have collapsed the setup complexity to under 20 minutes. The French government runs Linux on 2.5 million devices. Google runs Linux internally across its workforce. Every single barrier that kept gaming locked to Windows has been systematically removed. Not by a single competitor, not by a single product, by a slow accumulation of infrastructure decisions made by companies whose primary business is no longer Windows-dependent. Nvidia is the most significant name on that list, because Nvidia was the WA. For years, the argument ended with Nvidia. Linux gaming is fine until you need an Nvidia card. Then the performance drops, the features disappear, and you go back to Windows. That argument is gone. The company that created the wall just quietly dismantled it from the inside. Microsoft still has dominant market share. Windows still runs on the majority of gaming PCs. The inertia of 30 years of ecosystem lock-in does not evaporate overnight. None of that is being ignored, but dominant positions do not end with a single competitor winning. They end with the infrastructure underneath them quietly shifting until one day the dominant position is just a habit with no structural support left beneath it. Nvidia just removed the last structural support. The only thing holding Windows gaming together now is the fact that most people have not noticed. Yet, that is changing, and the companies that built the Windows gaming empire already know it. Are you still waiting to notice? Drop your take below.